Welcome back to the Marriage Can Win show. We are your relationship experts. I'm Eric, and this is my beautiful wife, Dr. Sakisha Heilig.
Now, here at Marriage Can Win, we educate, empower, and encourage couples to embrace that marriage can win, especially when you focus on 3 key areas. Now, all of our followers, you should be familiar with these. And it's number 1, improving your communication skills, developing sound money management skills, and enhancing your level of intimacy so your marriage can win.
Now, tonight, before we get started, I'm going to invite all of our listeners and all of our family and friends. Now, you know what I always say. Come on, share it out. Get your friends and your family, share it out. Start a watch party. And also let us know what city and state that you reside in.
Now, many of you may be familiar. We just recently released our latest book, which is Struggling to Keep the Vows. And we are so excited to have a phenomenal guest with us this evening, Dr. Janie Lacy. And we're talking a lot about the challenges that couples may be experiencing, but we also need to be mindful that there are things that, may be a little beyond their control why they're having some issues or some struggles in their marriages. So Dr. Janie is going to be here to shed some additional light on these challenges. So we are so excited. Thank you so much, Dr. Lacy, for joining us. How are you doing this evening?
I am doing great. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, awesome. For those guests that are just joining us, we want Dr. Lacy to tell you a little bit about her. Now, most of you, I'm sure you already know who she is, but for those of you who may not know, Dr. Lacy, can you tell our listeners a little bit about you?
Absolutely. So I'm a licensed psychotherapist and I'm the founder of Life Counseling Solutions. So we have 10 licensed psychotherapists. We all specialize in different areas: marriage, individual, children. We do workshops. And then I also have a premier program called Women Redeem. And that's for women healing from toxic relationships so that they can finally get the love that they want. So we do retreats and we do a 12-week intensive program.
Wow. Now awesome. That is amazing. So for all of our listeners, if you or someone you're struggling with challenges in a toxic relationship, make sure you connect with Dr. Lacy and get some additional information about her Women Redeemed program. So Dr. Lacy, we've been talking a little bit. We just released our book, Struggling to Keep the Vows, and we talked a lot about some of the challenges that couples may be having in their relationships. But there are certain things that I'd say, some challenges that they may be experiencing that may prevent them from having, I don't want to say from having successful relationships, but may make it a little more difficult to navigate that process. So we wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. You talked about earlier, you work with couples a lot that may have some past trauma or things of that nature that may be impacting their relationship. We want to know if you could shed additional light on that for us.
One of the things that we have found, especially coming or in this pandemic, is that mental health has been not at the top of most people's care package. So now that everyone has had to have a timeout and they've been home with their spouse, they've been finding out a lot of different challenges that now have come to the surface. We've been seeing relapses higher than ever, addictions that were not known before. We're seeing a lot of betrayal trauma, figuring and seeing that partner has now been talking to that girlfriend that they had before they were married on social media. We're discovering that our kids now have, whether it's pornography or there's other types of challenges that are coming to play. But one of the main things that we've been seeing a rise that people have been seeking services is for anxiety and depression, that a lot of times where people were in denial that they were even experiencing any type of depression or anxiety, or they were actually concerned about how their partner or how their family would respond to if they said, I don't have it all together. There's something that's going on with me and I don't know what to do. I need help. Most people, depending on their relation to mental health or what they think about mental health, will keep it a secret and they'll hold it until they can't hold it anymore. And one of the things we've been seeing through this pandemic is that they can't hold it anymore. Is that people have been forced to stay home together, and the things that may have gone unnoticed before can no longer, or we're no longer able to go unnoticed. So they've been having to address it. So during this time, we've been actually having an uptick in services for couples and for individuals to deal with anxiety, to deal with depression, to deal with addictive type behaviors, or just feeling lost because they've been furloughed or they've been let go and they found their identity through their jobs, and now having to figure out a different course of life because life wasn't the way that they planned it to be, especially in 2020.
All right. So for those couples out there listening, how can one spouse tell if they're just having a series of bad days, or if there's an actual challenge such as depression, anxiety? Is there something that, certain symptoms that they should look for, or, what if they have a concern in the back of their mind, but they're kind of straddling the fence, like, is this really an issue, or is this just a series of bad days because they've been furloughed or because they've been in quarantine?
Well, we look at a couple things. Some people may have a situational depression where it's not necessarily clinical depression. When we're looking at clinical depression, they have experienced the symptoms 6 months or more. If there's something that's acute, it's usually about 4 weeks. So if someone has either insomnia or hypersomnia, meaning they're sleeping too much or they can't sleep, those are one of the hallmark symptoms. Or if there's a dramatic change in their appetite, they're either what we would consider binge eating, they're overeating, emotional eating, or they have no appetite. Are they crying uncontrollably without any type of trigger in particular? And are they easily to be irritable, or is there agitation? So we're looking at some key hallmark symptoms, but if we're looking for clinical depression, those symptoms would have had to be there about 6 months or more. But what we've been seeing is a lot of people experience a lot of acute depressive type symptoms. Okay. And they know that they feel fatigue more times than not. There's irritability, and it's not caused by any other medical condition. So if someone's experiencing those types of symptoms and they know it's not being caused by any other medical conditions, they may want to get checked out and see if there's something else going on there for them.
Wow. So for those couples, I've had wives reach out to me and say that, what, I'm a little concerned, my husband's acting a little different, but I'm not quite sure how to approach them. How do you approach the subject of, honey, I think something's going on. I know you're sleeping excessively. I know this to change because, we tend to know our partners better than anyone else. You can tell when there's a change in their demeanor. There's something that's just not right. So how do you, approach the situation without escalating it? Is what I'm pretty much looking.
Because men can be like, "Oh, I'm okay. Leave me alone.
Yeah.
Just grab me a beer or something."
Oh my goodness.
So I can understand that. Yeah.
Okay.
I think what matters the most before someone attempts to approach their partner is what was their communication style before? Because what tends to happen, or where we see things go off the rails, is they didn't have good communication skills with each other before, or there was no safety in the relationship. When I say safety, emotional safety, where they couldn't necessarily talk about things that were vulnerable. So if she or he is approaching their spouse and they didn't have those key pillars there before, the person may be a little bit in denial, or they're not going to be quick to say, there is something going on with me. So the first thing that there has to be is what we call holding space. There has to be safety where people can be themselves. They can go into a vulnerable conversation. They don't feel like someone's going to interrupt them or try to change their reality, or judge them. So most couples, even though you can be sleeping with your partner every single night, you don't necessarily feel safe with them. And I'm talking about emotional safety. So if there is a couple that does have that emotional safety and they can go to each other and talk to each other, you can say something like, "Hey babe, I've been noticing that these a few things have been off, and I'm wondering if there's anything that I can do to support you, or is there anything that you need from me?" Because if you come out the gate where, I noticed you've been sleeping a lot, they're going to get defensive, right? So if they feel like you're judging them, but if you come with them in a place of, I'm concerned, I love you, and I just been noticing that you've been sleeping a little bit more, and I'm wondering how I can support you, if there's anything that you need from me. So if you come from that place, even if they may not come out the gate and say, I think there is something going on with me, you're starting to build a bridge of being able to have safe communication. So the things that you don't want to do is come out and just state the obvious. I've been noticing you've been eating a lot, you've gained a lot of weight, you're sleeping a lot, right? You're irritable, you're constantly agitated with me and the kids, right? So if you're coming out with that judgment, then they're going to say, "Well, just get me a beer." Not really, but they're going to be defensive, right? They're going to put their defensives up, and they're not going to necessarily feel safe. So when it comes to these vulnerable issues like anxiety or depression or any type of mental health issue, most people, the especially depending on how the family system has been set up, they don't necessarily are going to come out and say that because they're afraid to be rejected. They're afraid to be judged. Or depending on the family system, certain family systems, especially in certain cultures, we don't necessarily, we've grown up where there wasn't necessarily a such thing as mental health issues, right? So bring it to God or pray to God, right? So then we get into these denial patterns, and then we suffer in silence. And then we do get into clinical depression, because now we are going into 6 months, because this is the shocking thing that most people don't realize. Most people that actually have depression or anxiety, they go to work. They get up in the morning. Yeah. We think to ourselves that they are the person that is sleeping they're sleeping or they're doing all these things. But most people push through and they will power through. And sometimes that's not healthy, but they do that because they feel like there's something off, but they don't necessarily know what's off. But they'll still get up, and it's just like the functional alcoholics, so to speak. The alcoholics, not everyone that is an alcoholic, they're going to just be having beer bottles around them, right? They can still function as adults. So we have to be careful not to have these stigmas and this judgment in particular.
Yeah. Well, I can understand that, because from the man perspective, you got to look at, I got to go to work because I got to pay the bills. So, I just got to shake it off, but like you said, there's always going to be something different that happens.
Absolutely.
There may be just like a withdrawing completely from sexual activities, right. Where normally there's a normal healthy sex life. Then that changes. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess it could also change the other way, where there was a lack of sex life. Maybe there's an upbeat on sexual activity, because that's a way, instead of reaching to beer or drinking, they reach towards, sexual gratification or release, which I guess, absolutely, if you think about it, it's not a bad thing, right?
Well, it depends, right? Because we'll see a couple of things. With men in particular, with depression, we will see it manifest as anger, right? So that's where somebody will come into counseling and say, well, my husband has an anger issue. He's always snapping at me. So sometimes that's how it will manifest. But when it comes to now being hypersexual, there is something to what you're saying, in the sense that that's how they're coping, but it's not necessarily connecting as a couple, because when they come as a couple, she'll say, and I feel like I'm the container, there's no connection there. He wants to have more sex with me, those types of things. So sometimes it manifests and then it causes other issues, and then they're coming in because of this sexual issue. But then when we kind of really peel back the layers, we see that there's something else that's going on that provokes the change in their sexual life.
Yeah. So I have a question for you, because you talked about the importance of creating like a safe space so that your partner doesn't feel attacked. But we know that when we all come into marriage and relationships, we all have our own sets of baggage. Right. But how can one person live with a spouse? Well, I'm sure it's possible, that's dealing with a mental health issue, because sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming. Sometimes you feel like they're walking on eggshells, whether they're dealing with depression or anxiety or whatever the case may be. How can a spouse support their spouse, when they're dealing with mental health issues?
Well, first, there are many couples. There's lots of couples that are currently living in that state where someone does have a mental health challenge, whether it's known or unknown. Right. But when we look at a couple where it's known, there are some things that people that can do that are very helpful. And the first thing is to not take it personal. Because what happens is, if someone has insecurity in the relationship or they're codependent, that means that, they see something is off with you, and then they now take it on to themselves, and they now are trying to fix it. So you have to not take it personal. And then secondly, for a season, you may have to do a lot more things in the household to run that household, or with the kids, or running the errands, whatever that may be. So if you're the one who's supporting the person, then you're going to take on a lot more things than you probably would have, and be okay with that without the resentment coming in. Because when there's mental health in relationships and marriages, a lot of resentment can come into play if it's not known. And then the other thing that you can do is lean into the partner who is suffering. And you have, especially if it's a male, for example, I tell women that they have to lean into their femininity, right? They have to be soft, they have to be gentle, versus coming up with the masculine energy, because they're like, I'm doing everything in the house. When are you going to get over this, right? And then what happens is then that they don't feel safe, and they're going to shut down. So you have language, and you approach in a way that's loving and non-judgmental and that's supportive, and you seek to understand versus try to get them to understand your position. And you ask questions. How can I support you? Is there anything that you need from me? Right. But that means that she or he is going to have to put their stuff aside, right? Mm-hmm. I'm doing all these things, kids, blah, 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 right? Because that's where, truly being there for the helpmate part of it comes into play. And being able to ask them, is there something I can do to support you? Do you want me to come with you to a therapy session? Those types of things. So just being supportive. But I think the main thing that I see that partners do that disrupts that is they take it personal. They take it personal, or they don't understand because of their own views of mental health issues. So they'll tell them, get over it. Or when are you going to get over this? When are you going to stop with this nonsense? So I literally have sat and saw couples speak to each other that way when there truly was challenges. And what do you think happens to the other person? They're going to clam up. They're going to think, you know what? She's not safe, or he's not safe. So I got to deal with this on my own. And then they're going to be home. And then you're going to feel that they're there, but they're not there. And then that becomes a whole nother issue.
There, but not there. Yeah, that's a great way to describe it, because you think about couples I've spoken to, and that when the wife is saying, I just feel like he shuts me out, and you're like, okay, well, we have to go a little deper than that. But I also know, like, dealing with relationships, once it gets beyond a certain level, it's like, okay, you need a help that's going to be outside our scope of expertise. So. And that's why I was like, okay, well, let's call Janie, or let's call Dr. Lacy. But I mean, it's helpful to have spouses be able to recognize, that's especially true. Coming out of this pandemic. Yes. Like you said, couples are spending more time together. Before they could have masked it because they were going to work and they would, connect with friends and do other activities. But now, a lot of people were working from home. So that escape area, you don't have necessarily that safe zone, which you can establish one in your house where he has his little space to go and decompress and you have yours, but sure. You're both still there. So that's why some things tend to be, I want to say there's a greater awareness, if that's the proper way to explain it, because you can't hide it any longer. So I think this is really, really good information. So when you're thinking about, say, couples that are harboring past hurts and baggage, but they want to prevent it from growing, what's your recommendation to those couples? Because now you have a couple, one may have a mental health issue, but there's past hurt and baggage that's attributed to perhaps the way they responded to one another. They're lashing out, and you're trying to be supportive, but then you still have that hurt that you haven't dealt with on the inside, if that makes sense.
Well, this from what we've been dealing with, there's always a high percentage of individuals that have some kind of trauma or drama growing up. And women, surprisingly for men, I would say a very high percentage of some kind of sexual trauma growing up, some kind of abuse or domestic abuse. And then, now as adults, they put it behind in the forefront, but in the background, it manifests when it comes to a relationship. And that's where you talk about that baggage. Okay. So I can imagine now, Dr. Lacy, that you get a very high tick in activity, more business coming. Is that the case? Because
Absolutely.
Of the pandemic.
Absolutely. People are seeking services more than ever, especially couples, because you just mentioned it. Everyone has baggage in a relationship, but not everyone knows how to deal with it. And we cannot heal unless we deal with it. So what will happen is that people will get into the codependent behaviors. It's your job to make me happy. It's your job to make me feel a certain way. And I think a key part of that is to, and I'm going to give a number, but about 69% of all fights in a couple's relationship are unresolvable, right? Especially if it's happened in the past. So it's not about resolving it. It's about how can I lean in, especially what I see more for men is they feel like she's always bringing up the past. There's nothing I can do about it because the fix-it mentality goes into play when all she wants to do is have you acknowledge it and to lean into her. So teaching that is what we call the holding space. Can do a lot of healing as long as she feels like, or he, that you hear me, you get me, you see my pain. But what happens is it triggers the other person, is what we call splitting. If someone feels that they're either all good or all bad, if you're giving them criticism or you're telling them that something that you've done has hurt their heart, they're going to feel all bad if they're not aware of it. And then they're going to push it back out because they can't contain the all bad feeling, which is shame. And that's usually has to do with what they brought to the relationship, because it's what we call emotional regulation. So the two of you, everyone gets upset, you're going to get into a fight, but you need to be able to regulate your emotions so that you don't go into that space of disrespect and that it becomes harder to repair. So I say that the good and the bad can exist in the same place. You can be mad at your partner, but you can still respect them. But this is where we do go into our baggage. How did your parents fight? How did you bring into your previous relationship? So if someone betrayed you in your previous relationship, your amygdala, right, is going to go, it's what we call that reptilian brain. As soon as euphoric recall happens, euphoric recall is, you've been here before, and then your brain is going to be, okay, I've been here before, so this must be what happened in A or B. And then you respond with that over exaggeration or hyper reactivity. And in a coupleship, when anyone has hyper reactivity, it has more to do with the past and has to do with that trigger in particular. So individuals in the marriage, I always say you need to have a PhD in your own history. You need to know what your triggers are, what your trauma is, and how those things are going to affect you, because you mentioned sexual trauma. 1 out of 3 girls experience some type of sexual abuse by the time that she's 18, and 1 out of 6 boys. And, we have a lot of dysfunction when we look at just how we are groomed, right? We're groomed to think, okay, it's not about the love I can give, it's about the love I can get. Right. So when I'm dealing with just dating couples, I say, make that list. And then also, who wants to be with that person? Are you that person? It's just not about what you can get, but it's about what you can also give. And part of that is also vulnerability. That person needs to know if you've had previous depression, previous anxiety, if you've had previous sexual trauma, because it's amazing. And I'm sure the two of you have heard these stories. People can be married 20 years and they've never spoke about that sexual trauma that happened when she was 14. And he's always known that there's been something off. And I always feel like I'm just doing it to her. Right. So these are some clues that, there's something that needs to be dealt with, but it brings up a lot of stuff. And who wants to be judged and who wants to bring up their shame. So that's what prevents them from getting help.
Wow.
You brought about the scientific word of what we call high emotions, low intelligence, and we also talked about, and that's how we teach it. The couples that we work with, or when we're just teaching, and we tell them, look, when you get to that point when you can't verbally speak, you got to come up with a safe word, something that's Burger King, or something, and that lets the other person know, time out or something. Okay, I'm getting my high emotions. And then my intelligence and what I'm saying and speaking is very low. I may say something very hurtful. So that's where we have to have a time out. And that's when we talk about communication, where it's very key. We have to talk about the past and bring it up to the future, especially communication. From our first book, The Marriage Can Win, we categorize the 3 biggest issues that we call the Great Divide in relationships: communication, finance, and sex. The number 1 is communication. You have to communicate, especially about your finances and especially about sex, and that's where you talk about, like you stated, that past trauma has to come forward, because if you're trying to have sex and you wonder why she's what we call frigid franny during sex, you're like, well, what's the matter? Am I doing something wrong? And she doesn't ever say anything. That trauma that happened, like you were explaining, will never, be addressed, and there would not be pleasure in that intercourse.
And then you wind up pushing them away, and they feel like they take it personally and think it's something that they're doing wrong, when actually it's an unresolved issue. So
I know you've probably dealt with so many times. How do you normally at least approach that issue?
So if someone has not addressed it in their coupleship, they're not going to address it in front of me when they're going home with him, right? So a part of that is that she has to feel safe enough and connected with the therapist or with someone safe. So what I'll pick it up in a coupleship. And what I normally do, just my standard way of working with couples, is when they come in together, I always do 1 individual session, because before we go back together. So we do a couple session, 1 individual session, and a couple session. And I do that, and I'm very frank about it. I said I do that because at the end of the day, the two of you are going home with each other. So as good as willing as you are, you're also going to monitor what you say, knowing that when you leave Janie's office. So in those individual sessions, I'm finding out their family history. I'm asking the questions, because as a therapist, it's important that we ask the question And also we include that as far as pornography for women and men, because early exposure is also part of that, what we call templating. All of us have a template. So the first time we feel aroused, the first images we've gotten for sexual experience. And some people have had that just like a template on the computer. If it's a dysfunctional or not working template, it's going to affect every single thing that you put in that template. So in order to address that, I like to be able to first connect with her or him and then understand it, because most people, when they first expose it to me, they're not ready to tell their spouse, especially if their spouse is dysfunctional or abusive in any type of way, because they'll feel like he or she will use that against me. Well, I already told you there was something wrong with you, right? And they don't want to have to deal with that. So there has to be true safety, because it is a vulnerable space to be able to deal with some things that you probably never addressed or you've never wanted to address, especially if the couple got married very young. They married the image of who they wanted each other to be. And then when they really got into it, they came with all this other stuff. And some people will say to me, especially men that I work with that have been sexually abused, I was going to take this to the grave, and that's their feelings about it. But then they get to a place where they realize it is coming out of me in dysfunctional ways, and I no longer can hide it, and I need to start dealing with it because I know what it is. Recently been dealing with someone who's well over 60 and have just the first time is dealing with trauma that happened in their teenage years. Wow. So a lot of people carry these things, and then they have anger issues, they have depression, they have anxiety, or they have a cycle of dysfunctional relationships, whether in their marriage is vacillating from the same problems, or they can't maintain a long-term healthy relationship.
Okay. Well, you know what? That's really, really good. And I hope that the listeners are taking lots of notes, because this is definitely, it's blessing me. And I want to, we deal with a lot of couples, and a lot of times they're afraid for therapy. They feel that they're labeled, but the fact is, you need to do what you need to do to get the help that you need. Forget labels. Here's someone that's equipped to help you, to deal with the baggage that, perhaps you don't feel comfortable sharing with your partner. So instead of being afraid, how about try to embrace it, because you can finally get to the point where you're at peace with yourself. And, just talking to couples. I've dealt with young ladies who were molested when they were younger. And then you wonder, some people, they tend to become more hypersexual, and then some, they tend to withdraw. So you want to be able to be at the point where if you're going to marry this person, you need to be able to have that conversation. Yes, because definitely. If not, that builds up that wall. And he's just thinking like, I'm just not doing it for her. Maybe she should find somebody else. Maybe I should find somebody else. And you have lots of relationships that are, like they said, they're struggling to keep their vows because they're not having the conversations. They're not dealing with the truth. Right. And, instead of hiding it, and, you can only hide that stuff so long before that little molehill becomes a mountain. And then what happens, So even if you end the relationship and you get into a relationship with someone else, that baggage is still there until you deal with it. So I really want to just thank you for shedding some light on it. And hopefully the couples out there that are watching, the couples that are dating, you have that peace about it. So if you know that you've been struggling, that you have some past hurt, past baggage that you're holding on to, or you don't feel comfortable divulging to your partner, reach out to Dr. Lacy and connect. I know we definitely will be referring even more to you as well, because we deal with a lot of that. I mean, really, like you said, there's a high percentage, and I think it's really an even higher percentage in some of the issues in relationships, and it just doesn't manifest because it doesn't want to be shared. You know what I mean? So I'm like, once, let's say you do have couples that they actually tell each other about that. How do you get it to a point where it's a healthy, is it that they have to accept what happened in the past? Or, how do people really recover and have a healthy, relationship moving forward when they have that trauma in the past?
Well, there's several things, but to make it as simple as possible, the first thing that happens is people get frozen emotionally. So you can be a 50-year-old man, but you can be frozen at that 14-year-old emotional self where the trauma occurred. And the person who knows that will be the truth the most is that wife, right? Because when they get into a fight, she'll say, you acting like a child, or why do you always do this? So the emotionality is stunted. So the man could be in a man's body, but his emotionality is at a 14-year-old level. But when we look at really repairing the trauma, there's 3 pillars, and I'm going to make it very simple. The first one is going to be mindset. We have to be able to, because the stories that we tell ourselves about what happened matter. So if they're blaming themselves, because what will tend to happen, the thing that people don't talk about with sexual abuse in particular, is that our bodies respond. So her body or his body could have responded when they were being sexually abused as an 8-year-old boy, as a 12-year-old girl. And then they think in their mind, there must have been something I've done. So then we see that shame and stuff getting carried. And as you've mentioned, they'll either become hypersexual, they have promiscuity, or they become what we call sexually anorexia. They will shut down. There's a wall there, so to speak. So that's the first thing, is the mindset. And then the second thing is it's what we call inner work, or some people will call it childhood work, but it's inner work. It's really being able to understand, just as when we go to Italy, I remember going to Italy looking at these ruins, and we have to look at these books to understand what was there, to really know what we're looking at. It's the same thing in our life. We have to understand people, places, how our mindset developed, the things that have occurred to us, because it's not just keeping the past. We don't dwell on the past as the Bible tells us, but we have to understand how that past becomes our present. And then the third thing is body work. Trauma is stored in our body. So that's why it becomes a sexual issue for couples. It becomes because what I'll commonly hear is, well, she was promiscuous before we were married, so now we have married and she doesn't want to be with me. Because there's emotional connection, right? So there's been a templating of how sex looks and how it feels, right? So then that's part of why she has to understand her makeup. So we're looking at mindset, we're looking at inner work, and we're looking at somatic experiences, because this is where you probably have heard these too, as relationship experts. People can go to therapy and it doesn't work, because you can't just talk your way out of problems. You can't just, it doesn't just stop at the mindset. You got to do the healing work in the body, because the body keeps the score. If the mind doesn't remember, the body will remember, especially what we call pre-verbal times, because there's some people that have severe sexual trauma before they were ever even speaking, but the body can recall some of those types of things where they're just shut down sexually and later in life. So there's many different components to healing, but there's all of those components. And then obviously, depending on the person, bringing in their spirituality and their practices is hallmark and key and foundational.
Wow.
That is powerful.
It is.
I mean, when you think about it, because so there's so much more. So when you have couples that are truly struggling to keep their vows, it's so much more than the surface area. And that's why we encourage couples to have those necessary conversations. Make sure your interactions go beyond where a person lives, what they drive, what's in their bank account. Find out their history, how they are emotionally. And we tell couples, you need to get to know each other more than just one season. And it's not like you're saying it has to be a specific timetable, but how do they process things? How do they deal with anger? How do they deal with disappointment? All of those types of things. So who you're dealing with, because after 26 years, I have to be able to trust him. I'm at the point where medically I have to be able to trust him so he can give me injections. And then if I can't trust him in certain areas, I'd have to trust him to be able to make life or death decisions regarding my health and my life. And if all of our conversations were superficial, if it's just, ooh, he looks good, everything external, what happens when those things fade? As we get older, your bodies change. Is your relationship over because he no longer has a six-pack? Why are we hopping from relationship to relationship? If this person doesn't meet this need, then you're on to the next. What is it you're looking for? What is it you're missing? So we encourage couples, have those deep dive conversations, maybe not on the first date, work your way in.
But this really, I think, feeds into the types of love languages that individuals have. And then, of course, you have to learn each other's love language. But I think that also, that trauma and the things that you were speaking about really feeds into how a person develops a love language, because of, it might be they don't have a touch love language because of some trauma in the past. And, or maybe because of it was a verbal abuse. So now they need acts of service or affirmation, you know? So I think, so is that normal? Is it because of some trauma that forced a certain type of love language? Or, I mean, you know what I mean?
Absolutely. So a couple of things when it comes to love languages, it's usually in the way that we felt loved as a child, right? Okay. So if your dad didn't say, I love you, but he would give you gifts, and that's how you receive love, then you're going to be looking for your husband or your wife to give you that gifts, you know, and they're in the grocery store that they're thinking about you and getting your favorite candy. But the other part of it, to your point, is that there's trauma in the area of what someone needs, their love language. So if a husband, let's say he needs love language of affection, and that's how he feels loved, but that's an area of trauma for her. So it'd be really difficult for her. You know, it's what we call the stretching principle in marriage. The very thing that your partner needs is usually the very thing that stretches you. So when there's trauma, it's going to even stretch you even more because there's trauma there. So your attempts to even do that is going to feel like it's a violation to yourself, especially if it's unhealed trauma. If it's something that you're working through and you're being guided and you have the support, you can work through that. But it's usually when I see people I'm usually curious when they're completely shut down to giving their partners what they need. And then I'm curious because usually when there's such, I'm going to put my heels in the ground, so to speak, there's usually something more to that. But the more she shuts down and the more he's criticizing or the more that he gets frustrated, she really puts her heels down. And then we get into that double bind type system, and the love language doesn't solve anything. He's getting more frustrated because my needs are not being met. And inside of her, she's like an individual. She's like, Janie, I just can't. And this is what's happening. I just feel shut down. And then there has to be a place of safety, even for us as therapists. People don't come into therapy, even though they're there. They don't trust us out the gate because they're looking at how we're responding. Are we judging them? You know, I remember one time someone didn't come back to therapy, and I like to follow up to see what happened. And she told me when she had mentioned something to me very specific and vulnerable, I had crossed my legs at that very time. So people are very sensitive when they're opening up, right? They're reading your body language, and they can be reading into things to feeling judged in particular. So a lot of that stuff, it's not just the surface. Okay, well, I need this. I need you to do this. If the people have trouble doing that and they really are shut down in that area, there's usually an indication that there's something more to it when we're speaking about the love languages in particular.
Wow. I mean, this has been so informative. I literally could keep you here all night writing notes. So if you could just take a moment, what is one of your key takeaways for couples that may be facing the struggle because one partner has a mental health issue? What would be your one word of advice to them?
To seek help. Because most people, they have trouble supporting the person who may be struggling with mental illness, and however they were showing up in their relationship may not serve them in this particular incident or support them getting help. Because there's other situations where people are getting help and their spouses are not supportive. If it's not the pastor, they're not supportive with them getting the help that they need. So being supportive to them, and if you're not able to be that support system, helping them get the right support in place for them.
All right. So what's next for Dr. Janie Lacy?
Well, lots of things going on. So at Life Counseling Solutions, you know, we have lots of different programs. We have a once a month 8-hour anger management program. One of our therapists, Melissa, has a lunch and learn coming up for providers just like yourself, not necessarily for clients, talking about mindfulness and meditation practices. You know, and then we have our Women Redeem program. We're in our 12-week program right now. And then we have our retreat. We have our retreat coming up again next year. So if there's usually a need there, between all 10 of us, we can be a support system to many people, whether they're children, couples, or just those that just need a mental health checkup. We're here to help.
All right.
So how can everyone
solutions, and they can see all the different therapists, our different specialties, and the different programs that we offer, and we'll be glad to be of service.
And also, is there an email that maybe they want to ask you a couple of questions, and then they just want to email you directly?
Well, they can find me on any of the social media handles at Janie Lacy, and we usually respond to any questions or any inboxes fairly quickly.
All right. So, Dr. Lacy, we just want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. You have definitely poured out and poured into our listeners, and you've brought some real, raw, and relevant information to the Marriage Can Win show, and we really, really appreciate it. Again, we encourage our listeners, if you are struggling with challenges with mental health, Dr. Lacy has more than that. She has a plethora of experience and an entire staff that they're more than willing to help meet your needs. So make sure you stay connected with her. And we just wanted to thank you again for joining us. And we'd love to have you on again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So to all of our family out there, do remember that you need to catch us every Tuesday night at 9:00 on the Love Radio Network. You can also listen to us on Alexa. And then every Friday night, right before Midnight Love, at 8:00, we have Date Night with the Highlights. So that's Friday at 8:00 before Midnight Love, and Saturday at 8:00 before Midnight Love.
All right. Now, remember, you can be the change that you want to see in your relationship. Until next time.
Bye.